Hello, in today's video, I want to talk to you about some tips for success if you're working on your PhD whilst we're in the midst of this coronavirus crisis. And so really I'm going to be covering 3 tips for being successful in your PhD during lockdown and not getting sort of bogged down or discouraged by the fact that what you can do is quite possibly and very likely very limited at the moment because of the situation. Now, I'm in the UK where we've been under some kind of lockdown since the end of March. It is gradually easing at the moment, and there is some hope that our libraries and archives might open soon, though for many of them it seems like September might be the earliest, which still leaves a month and a half of summertime during which many of us would want to be doing and progressing in our research. So I just want to give you 3 tips sort of for how I've managed in the last couple of months under lockdown, and indeed how I would foresee myself continuing to manage as long as the situation doesn't change or as long as I'm unable to access some of those archives or resources or libraries which I would otherwise need to progress substantially with my PhD. So tip number 1, keep a list of everything that you'd like to access. So what I've done is, because I work with my PhD entirely on Google Drive, I have one dedicated document on Google Drive on which I'm listing all of the secondary sources and primary sources, because I'm a historian, which I would like to access once the restriction rises, once I'm allowed to actually go to these archives and libraries and view these things. Now, one key point of note here, make sure that you absolutely annotate these notes. I've already discovered that some things that I was writing down on this document back in April, so for instance, I might be reading through one of my secondary resources and I came across a primary resource and I thought, oh, this is really good. I should have a look at this when lockdown ends. And I wrote it down in my document, but I didn't add any notes on it. And so it'll say, make sure you access Joseph Smith's letters on such and such. But I don't remember why, because I haven't read that particular thing since April. So make sure you don't make that mistake that I did, and you definitely annotate it. So from thenceforth, I ensured that if I was adding things to this document, I was saying why I wanted to look at it. Make sure that you look at Joseph Smith's letters, because as discussed here in Manning's book, this is a really key point on how love is demonstrated in a familial sense on page 284, etc. So make sure that you're annotating these so that when you do pick up this document and finally get the chance to go and view the resources, whether it be at libraries, archives, anywhere else, that you know exactly what you're looking for and why you're looking for it. And indeed, this tip should extend even beyond the lockdown period and would be useful at any other time when you're trying to manage your workload and doing your PhD. Tip number 2, catch up on some reading. So if you're anything like me, you probably have piles and piles of books, journal articles, and perhaps even primary sources, or if you're in the sciences, some data that you really need to look at, but you haven't had the chance or you haven't devoted the time to do so yet during your PhD. Well, if you can't go out and access those archives and libraries that you might need to do other parts of your PhD, then spend this time catching up on those aspects that you might have put off to later on in your PhD time. So I've been catching up on some secondary reading that has piled up. I've had journal articles, a stack this high that I printed out months ago that I haven't had the chance to tackle. Well, I've had the chance to do so now. So this is a great opportunity to try to catch up in doing those sorts of things. Also for me, as a historian, when I visit archives and libraries to view primary sources, my habit is to take photographs of all of the different sources and then bring those photographs back home, organize them, and view them at a later time. And so I have a USB stick that's full of primary sources that I haven't yet interrogated. So this is also a great opportunity for me to actually have a look at those primary sources, view all of these things that I haven't had the chance to look at yet, and really spend some time sort of digging my feet in deeper into these little aspects of my PhD research that I haven't yet had the chance to do. And finally, tip number 3, if you already feel like you've done tip number 1 and tip number 2 and you're still feeling like you might be hitting a brick wall, then my final tip is to follow up on some of those bunny trails. So I'm sure if you're anything like me in the course of doing your PhD, you've come across some tangential little areas of research which aren't quite entirely relevant to your PhD, but really, really interesting. And you've really wanted to sort of follow the rabbit down the hole, so to speak, and figure out where that research might take you. But being very reasonable and wise, you have not done so yet because you've had to focus on sort of the mainstay of your PhD. Well, if you find you are hitting a brick wall because of the restrictions in place at the moment, or indeed, actually, I've even done this when I feel like I've hit writer's block, where I just don't feel like I can move any further in my PhD, even when I have been able to access all of the resources which are currently locked down, then I really, really recommend you spending some time sort of reinvigorating your enthusiasm and passion by chasing up some of those bunny trails. So for me, this has looked like delving a bit deeper into some of the personal lives and biographies of some of the people whom I am looking at for my PhD, where I wouldn't necessarily need to know all of this detailed information about them, but it's supremely interesting just to me. It helps to invigorate my passion for what I'm doing, and I've dug down deep into learning about some of these dissenters that I'm looking at for my PhD in history, and I've decided to turn some of these into blog posts. I've turned some of them into podcast episodes, just different ways to make sure I'm still engaging with my research and producing something creatively, even though it's not necessarily for my actual PhD. So I would really encourage, if you are having some kind of writer's block, or if you are feeling really those heavy restrictions which are impeding you from progressing in your PhD, then pick up some of those little bits that you weren't able to research before and just follow that rabbit trail and see whether that can help reinvigorate your passion and help teach you a few interesting things. Indeed, sometimes when I'm following these rabbit trails, so to speak, I find that I do end up finding information that will be really pertinent and useful for my PhD that I wouldn't otherwise have found. So those are my top 3 tips for staying busy, staying active, and indeed reinvigorating your enthusiasm during this period. I hope you find them useful. If you have any of your own tips to add that you found useful, please do add them in the comments below this video or share them on social media. And indeed, please do subscribe to this YouTube channel for more research tips. Thank you.